Kelam kozmolojik argümanı nedir?
Kelam cosmological argument seeks to answer the big questions about existence. So why is there something rather than nothing? And where did everything that we observe come from? Is there a first cause? And if there is, why think that this first cause is God? Now, I have addressed these big questions in two of my previous books. The first one is God and Ultimate Origins. And the second one is the teleological and Kelam cosmological arguments revisited. Now, the second book is open access, which means that you and your audience can download it for free on my academia.edu website and also on amazon.com. So in what follows, I'm going to present a brief summary of the arguments within 20 minutes, right? Okay, so to answer the first question, is there a first cause? The first few premises goes like this. Premise one, there exists a series of causes and effects and changes. So by changes, I mean events. I mean things that happen, right? So for example, I was born, right? This was an event that happened 40 plus years ago. And I came from my parents, right? So my parents are the causes and I'm the effect. And if you ask where my parents come from, I say, well, my parents came from my grandparents, right? And if you ask where did my grandparents come from, then I'll say my grandparents came from my great-grandparents. Now, the question to ask is, could there be an infinite regress of causes and effects? So the series either has an infinite regress that avoids the first cause, or its members are joined together like a closed loop that avoids the first cause, or the series has a first cause, right? So either the series is infinite or it's finite. If it's finite, then either the ends are joined together like a loop that avoids the first cause, or the ends are not joined together, right? If the ends are not joined together, then that means that there is a beginning, right? There is a first cause. So these are all the logical possibilities. And in my book, I go on to explain that it is not the case that the series has an infinite regress, and it's not the case that its members are joined together like a closed loop, and therefore the series has a first cause. So the key premises that needs to be defended are highlighted in yellow, right? So why think that there cannot be an infinite regress? Now, in my book, I mentioned that there are at least 5 arguments to show that an infinite regress is not the case. And any one of these arguments will be sufficient to establish this point. So the proponent of the Kelam does not have to defend all 5 arguments, or any one of these arguments will be sufficient. And so because we don't have infinite time, so let me just explain one of these arguments. So one of these arguments is the argument from the viciousness of dependence regress. So think about it this way, right? A dependence regress is a vicious regress, a causal regress is a dependence regress, and therefore a causal regress is a vicious regress. So to explain this, think about a series of train cars, each of which, they are not moving originally, right? So they are all stationary. Now, in order for the last train car to begin to move, the one before it has to begin to move first. But before the one begin to move, the one before it has to begin to move first. Now, if that is all there is, then obviously none of them will begin to move, right? Because everyone is dependent on the one before it in order to begin to move. So what will be required is that there must be a first engine, right? A first puller, something that does not depend, something that does not require another thing before it, right? That doesn't depend on another thing before it. Such a thing needs to exist in order that the rest of the train cars can begin to move, right? So so as I explained here, right, that what is required is an engine. Why? Because otherwise, if everything is dependent on the one before it, then no prior wagon would escape from the problem of depending on the prior dependent member in order to gain movement. So this will be a vicious regress. So likewise, before I begin to exist, my parents had to begin to exist. But before they begin to exist, their parents have to begin to exist. Now, if that is the case, then no matter how many prior dependent causes there are, none of them will begin to exist, Why? Because no prior dependent cause escapes from the problem of depending on the prior dependent member in order to begin to exist. So again, this will be a vicious regress. So what is required is that there must be a first cause which exists independently and necessarily. So such a first cause must exist, right, in order that the rest of the things can exist. So this is a proof that there must be a first cause. And this proof also addresses the question, can a first cause be avoided by a causal loop? Now, a causal loop in which A depends on B, B depends on C, C depends on A is viciously circular. It will be like saying that a train car A depends on train car B, but train car B depends on train car C, but train car C depends on train car A. Now, this will be viciously circular, right? You'll be saying like, for example, saying that I depend on my parents before I can begin to exist, but my parents depend on my grandparents, and my grandparents depend on me, right? Now, obviously, that cannot work. So a causal loop like this, right, cannot avoid a first cause. So there must still be a first cause, right? There must still be something that is independent, that exists independently, necessarily, and so such a first cause must exist. And therefore, the next question is, why think that this first cause is God? So the next few steps of the argument explain the answer. So premise 6 says that since the first cause is the first, it must be uncaused, right? There must be a first cause that does not need to depend on something else, right? As I already explained previously. So such a first cause will have to be uncaused. And premise 7 says that since whatever begins to exist has a cause, and this is known as the causal principle, the first cause must be without beginning. So this is another key premise that needs to be defended, right? So why think that whatever begins to exist has a cause? Now, there are at least 5 arguments for thinking that this principle is true. And so there's a modus tollens argument, which is a deductive argument, which I defend in chapter 3 of my book. But there are other arguments, such as the rationality argument, right, which says that we won't be able to think rationally, right, if the causal principle is violated. And there's also an inductive argument, a conceptual argument, and also the argument from fine-tuning and the order universe, right, which argue that it is implausible or probabilistically unlikely that a universe that is fine-tuned and highly ordered would begin uncaused. If someone say that the universe began uncaused, right? So so I explain all these arguments in my book, and so again, any one of these arguments will be enough, right, to provide adequate reason for thinking that this premise is true, for thinking that the universe did not begin uncaused. So let me just explain one of these arguments, right? So I shall explain the first one, the modus tollens argument. So now before I explain it, I need to explain the key terms of the causal principle. So this principle, whatever begins to exist as a cause, is based on the idea that something does not come from nothing, right? Something does not come from nothing. And so whatever here refers to whatever, right? Things, events, states of affairs, arrangements, whatsoever. And begins to exist refer to having a finite temporal extension with boundaries, right? So for example, I began to exist in 1975. Right? I did not exist prior to that, right? So 1975 is the temporal boundary, right, of my existence. And cause refers to a necessary condition here, right? So it is not referring to a sufficient condition, it's referring to a necessary condition. And the reason is because, as I said, right, the principle is based on the idea that something does not come from nothing. So if something comes from something, right, if something has a necessary condition, then it will not be uncaused, right? So because it will come from something, right? So it doesn't come from nothing. And so, by the word cause, it's referring to a necessary condition here. And so with this clarification, it becomes obvious that quantum physics does not violate the causal principle. Why? Because quantum fluctuations, they have causally necessary conditions, such as the quantum field, right? So a fluctuation is requires is a change in the pre-existing quantum field, and so the quantum field is something, right? So the fluctuation do not come from absolute nothing. It actually it's actually a change in the quantum field, which is something that exists prior to that. And so the quantum field is a necessary condition. It didn't so quantum fluctuations did not come from nothing, and so it is not a violation of the causal principle. And moreover, there are viable deterministic interpretations of quantum physics, such as David Bohm's interpretation, Everett's interpretation. And so, so there's no good reason to think that quantum physics violate the causal principle. Now, if we talk about radioactive decay, again, there are necessary conditions, right? The nuclei needs to exist first before it can decay, right? And moreover, the decay follows statistical regularities, which indicate that there is more fundamental ordered causes that exist in order that the decay will follow these statistics. And so, to find out more, you can check out the links which I attach on this PowerPoint slide, which explain all these points in greater detail. But in any case, the point here is that quantum physics does not violate the causal principle. Okay, but why think that the causal principle is true? On the other hand, well, we have good reason to think that it's true. I mentioned that there are at least 5 reasons. So let me explain one of them, the modus tollens arguments. Right, so this is a deductive argument, right? So this is not an inductive argument. It's not based on generalization of our experience, but rather is based on deduction. So a modus tollens argument is if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? So the argument goes like this. If something such as X, for example, right? If X begins uncaused, then some other particular things or events which begin or could begin to exist would also begin uncaused. So some other particular things could be like some events or things that exist around me, for example, such as the electric field around me increase in strength, for example. Now, we know that such events, I do not experience electric field suddenly increase in strength that will shock me to death, right? Such events, we know that in our normal experience, right, we need to switch on, right, the electric generator, right, before the field will increase. However, the argument here is that if something begin uncaused, then such events as the increase in strength of electric field, they would also increase in strength around me, right? For example, but that is not the case, right? It is not the case that such events like Y, which we call this Y, for example, right? It's not the case that such events begin uncaused. And therefore, it is not that case that something began uncaused, right? It's not the case that X, for example, began uncaused. And so this implies that whatever begins to exist has a cause, right? Because otherwise, our experience will be very different, right? If things around us begin uncaused, right, that will shock us to death, for example, right? Shock us to death, which is not the case, right? So we can conclude that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And so the key premise, so I think premise 2 is obviously true. So the key premise is premise 1, right? So why think that premise 1 is true? Why think that if something begins uncaused, some other particular things would also begin uncaused? Now, I explained this in great detail in chapter 3 of my book, but I shall explain this very briefly here. So very briefly, the justification for premise 1 is that if X begins uncaused, then this means that there will be no cause that makes it the case that only X rather than Y begin uncaused. Right? So now in our usual day-to-day experience, we know that things that begin to exist are determined by the cause, right? So for example, why am I a human being? Why am I not a dinosaur, for example? Well, the reason is because my parents, their sperm and egg determine that I'm a human being, right? So because my father is a human being, my mother is a human being, and therefore I'm a human being, right? So if my father is a dinosaur and my mother is a dinosaur, then I will be a dinosaur, right? So this means that the nature of the cause determines the effect, right? However, if something begins uncaused, then that means that there will be no cause that determines the effect. There will be no cause that makes it the case that only X rather than Y begin uncaused. And moreover, the properties of X and the properties of Y, which differentiate between them, will only be had by them only when they had already begun to exist. Which means that the difference between X and Y cannot make a difference to what began to exist. And moreover, the circumstance is compatible with the beginning of y. So for example, the circumstances around me is compatible with an electric field increasing in strength, right? We know that such events can happen, they do happen often. And so there will be nothing that prevents y from beginning to exist. And therefore, if x begins to exist uncaused, the three reasons which I mentioned just now will generally imply that there will be no difference between x and y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, right? There will be no difference between x and y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, because there will be nothing that could make a difference. And therefore, if x began uncaused, y would also begin uncaused, right? But that is not the case, as mentioned just now, right? It's not the case that electric field around me just began uncaused and shock me to death, right? That's not the case. And therefore, it can be concluded that it is not the case that x begins uncaused, right? It's not the case that something begins uncaused. And so this proves that whatever begins to exist has a cause, right? So this is the causal principle. And so this argument proves that the causal principle is true. And so we have arrived at the conclusion, right, that there must be a first cause, which is uncaused and without beginning. Now, the next step of the argument shows that the first cause was initially changeless. Now, how do we know that? Well, the reason is because, firstly, an infinite regress of change is impossible, and there must be a first change. As I already explained just now, right, there cannot be an infinite regress. And a change is defined as an event, something that happened, and something that happened would have the beginning. A change is something that has a beginning at the state of having gained or lost a property, right? That's the meaning of the word change. And I have also explained just now that whatever begins to exist has a cause, and therefore the first change would have to have a cause, right? You have to have a first cause. Now, the cause cannot be a change prior to the first change, because otherwise the first change wouldn't be the first. And therefore, the first cause cannot be a change, right? The first cause must be initially changeless. And so the first cause must be without beginning and initially changeless, which means that it was existing initially without any event. And so since the first cause is initially changeless, it also means that the first cause is transcendent and immaterial, right? So the first cause must be something that transcends our ordinary experience. Why? Because our ordinary experiences is characterized by change, right? We see that changes happen constantly around us. However, the first cause is initially changeless. So it means that it's something that transcends our usual experience. And moreover, it is immaterial. Why? Because physics, which studies material things, tells us that physical things are constantly changing. So for example, the quantum systems, they are constantly changing. However, the first cause is initially changeless, right? So it means that it is not a quantum state, right? It is not a quantum system. And so the first cause must be something immaterial, non-physical. And so the key question we need to answer here is how can the first cause, which is initially changeless, cause the first change? How did it cause the first effect? So in order to cause the first effect or the first event, regardless of whether it's the Big Bang or whatever, from an initially changeless state, the first cause must have, firstly, the capacity to originate the first effect or the first event in a way that is undetermined by prior events, since the first cause is the first, right? So the first cause must be able to bring about the first event by itself. And moreover, it must also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing. For otherwise, the first cause would not have been initially changeless and existing beginninglessly without the first change. And so the first cause must be able to hold back from changing initially, and yet also have the capacity to bring about the first change by itself. So these two capacities imply that the first cause has libertarian freedom, right? It is something that is free. It can freely refrain from change and can freely bring about the first change. So this describes libertarian freedom. And it also indicates that the first cause is not something like a natural law, right? It is not something that just behave like regularity, because something that behave regularly according to natural laws, such a thing doesn't have free will, right? Doesn't have free choice. It doesn't have liberty and freedom. However, the first cause is something that has freedom, right? Which means that it's not impersonal agent. It's not an impersonal thing, right? But rather it is a personal agent which can freely bring about the first event. And so this implies that the first cause is a personal creator. And it also implies that the first cause is distinct, right, from the impersonal material universe, which does not have free will. And the cosmological argument can also be combined with the teleological argument. And so we can add one more premise here to say that in order to bring about a universe with its sophisticated, highly ordered, mathematically describable laws of nature, the first cause must be highly intelligent, right? So if you look at this photo, right, it says I was here, right? This on the beach. Somebody. Now, even though we don't see anybody there, we know that somebody must have written this, right? Because these words couldn't have emerged or be created or be caused by the rain or the waves or the wind, right? Natural forces, random forces wouldn't have produced such information. Likewise, if we study physics, right, we discover that there's all this information which is inscribed into the laws of nature, right, in the form of mathematical equations, right, which are highly sophisticated, elegant mathematical equations, right, such as E = mc squared, for example. Now, E = mc squared is not something that is created by Einstein, right? Einstein did not create E = mc squared. Rather, Einstein only discovered E = mc squared, right? So before Einstein discovered E = mc squared, right, E = mc squared is already there, right? So who is it that wrote this equation, right, into the fabric of physics? And so Einstein, I think that there must be a superior mind, right, who is behind the highly ordered nature which we observe and which scientists study and discover. And so there must be an intelligent creator, right, of the universe. And so this indicates that the first cause must be something that is highly intelligent as well, right, in order to bring about a universe which is so highly ordered and also fine-tuned. And moreover, in order to bring about a universe with the billions of stars and galaxies, the first cause must be enormously powerful as well, right, in order to bring about such a huge universe, right, with billions of stars and galaxies. And so we can conclude that the universe must have come from a first cause that is uncaused, without beginning, transcendent, immaterial, has libertarian freedom, is intelligent, and also enormously powerful. Such a first cause is what we mean by a personal creator of the universe. And therefore, a creator of the universe must exist, right? There must be a God who created the universe. So such a creator God must exist. Now, we need to note here that the conclusion, the conclusion of a sound argument must be true, right? So if an argument is deductively valid, and if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, right? And I have already explained just now that the cosmological argument is deductively valid, and I have also explained just now that the premises are true, and therefore the conclusion must be true. And so we can know for sure that there must be a creator of the universe. And that is the conclusion of the Kelam cosmological argument.